The summer heat shimmered above the dusty streets of Redemption Creek as Catherine Blackwood sat on her weathered porch, her withered hands carefully mending a quilt. Grey hair pulled into a simple bun, faded blue dress neatly pressed despite the heat. She appeared to be nothing more than a fragile widow counting her remaining days in quiet solitude. The four riders approaching from the Western Trail couldn't know that beneath her elderly facade beat the heart of Red Catherine Morgan, the most ruthless bandit queen the Dakota Territory had ever feared, a woman whose name once made even hardened lawmen check their holsters twice before entering a saloon. The riders slowed as they approached, dust billowing around their horses' hooves as they surveyed her modest homestead with calculating eyes. Catherine's arthritic fingers subtly shifted their grip on her sewing needle, the seemingly innocent tool now poised like a weapon between weathered knuckles. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Few people remembered the notorious outlaw who had vanished during the infamous gallows. Greek shootout of 1878. A woman presumed dead for 17 years. Even fewer would connect that blood-soaked legend to the respected widow who had settled in Redemption Creek a decade ago, known for her apple pies and gentle advice to young mothers. The lead rider, a tall man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jawline, removed his hat in a mocking gesture of politeness. Catherine recognized the tactical assessment in his eyes, the way they marked the distance to her door, noted the apparent absence of weapons, measured her physical frailty against whatever resistance he anticipated. She had used that same calculating gaze herself when selecting banks and stagecoaches across 3 territories during the height of her reign. "Afternoon, ma'am," the scarred man called out, his voice carrying a forced politeness that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Name's Jackson Corvus. My associates and I have been riding since sunrise. Wonder if we might trouble you for some water for our horses. Maybe rest a spell in the shade?" Catherine straightened slowly, one hand pressing against her lower back, as if the movement caused her pain. The performance was flawless. Decades of practice had made the disguise of age and frailty second nature. To the casual observer, she appeared to be exactly what she claimed, a harmless old woman cautiously assessing unexpected visitors. "Of course, young man," she replied, her voice carrying a slight quaver that masked its natural authority. "No one should be out in this heat. Without proper rest, the pumps around back by the barn. Help yourselves." Inside the small but solidly built house, 27-year-old Rebecca Thorne watched through a narrow gap in the curtains, her heart racing but her hands steady as they rested near the loaded Winchester rifle propped against the wall. Unlike Catherine's neighbors in Redemption Creek, who believed Rebecca to be a widowed niece who had come to help her aging aunt maintain her property, Rebecca knew fragments of Catherine's true history. She had seen the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards where Catherine kept newspaper clippings of long-ago robberies. She had glimpsed the collection of wanted posters Catherine had preserved, faces faded, but names still legible, and most telling of all. She had witnessed Catherine's transformation 2 months ago when a drifter had tried to rob them during the spring cattle drive. Before Rebecca could even reach for the shotgun kept behind the kitchen door, Catherine had moved, with shocking speed and precision, her frail appearance giving way to lethal efficiency. The drifter had left with a knife wound in his thigh and terror in his eyes, having never expected the elderly woman to move like a mountain lion. That night had changed everything between them. "There are things about me you should know," Catherine had said afterward, her voice carrying a hardness Rebecca had never heard before. "Things that mean you might not want to stay under my roof any longer." But Rebecca had stayed, the daughter of a traveling medicine show performer who had died when Rebecca was 19, leaving her to navigate a world that offered few options to women without family connections. She had recognized in Catherine a kindred spirit. someone who had carved her own path in a world designed to limit female ambition. Instead of leaving, Rebecca had simply asked Catherine to teach her more about self-defense, fascinated by the glimpse of the formidable woman beneath the widow's facade. Now, watching Jackson Corvus and his men evaluate Catherine's property with the practiced eyes of predators, Rebecca moved silently to the position they had rehearsed, behind the heavy oak armoire that had been strategically positioned months ago to provide cover while allowing a clear line of sight to the front door. Outside, Catherine gestured toward her small porch. "Would you gentlemen care for some lemonade? Made fresh this morning." Jackson Corvus dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. Unlike his companions, whose attention wandered to the outbuildings and the distant tree line, Jackson's gaze remained fixed on Catherine, studying her with unusual intensity. "Mighty kind of you, Mrs." He let the question hang in the air. "Blackwood," she supplied, moving with the careful, measured steps of the elderly toward the porch. "Catherine Blackwood. My husband Ezra built this place after the war. God rest his soul. He's been gone these 12 years now." Every word was calculated, the fictional husband, the timeline that placed her arrival in Redemption Creek well after Red Catherine's notorious career had ended, the subtle reinforcement of her widow's identity. As she reached the porch steps, she paused as if to catch her breath, but actually to note the positions of all four men. One still mounted, keeping watch, one examining the barn with too much interest, and two, Jackson and a lean, hard-faced man following close behind her. "Blackwood," Jackson repeated, testing the name. "Can't say I've heard of any Blackwoods in these parts." "Where did you and your husband come from originally, Mrs. Blackwood?" Catherine's weathered face revealed nothing as she replied, "Ohio originally. Ezra wanted open country after Gettysburg, never did care for crowds." She turned her attention to the house, calling out as she opened the door. "Rebecca, dear, we have travelers seeking refreshment. Would you put on more coffee?" Rebecca appeared. In the doorway, her simple brown dress and carefully composed expression, revealing nothing of the tension vibrating through her. "Of course, Aunt Catherine," she responded, her eyes carefully avoiding direct contact with either Jackson or his companion as she retreated toward the kitchen. Inside the barn, the man called Silas was already examining the structure with professional interest. Unlike typical frontier barns with their simple designs, Catherine's barn contained subtle modifications that would immediately strike anyone familiar with tactical positioning. The stalls arranged to prevent clear lines of sight from the entrance. The loft ladder positioned to provide elevated cover. The unusual thickness of the rear wall, where most barns would have wide gaps between planks. "Mitch," Silas called softly, gesturing toward the rear wall. "Take a look at this." The broader man approached, his heavy brows furrowing as he studied the wall. "What about it? Notice anything odd? No gaps for ventilation here. And look at these hinges, hidden, but definitely there." Mitch ran his fingers along a nearly invisible seam in the wooden planking. "This ain't just a wall." Back in the house, Catherine settled into a rocking chair near the fireplace, her movements deliberately, slow and stiff. Jackson and his companion, who he introduced as Levi, took seats at the kitchen table, their posture relaxed but their eyes continuously scanning the room, noting exits, windows, and potential weapons. "Bad business out at the Harrison Ranch last month," Jackson commented casually, watching Catherine's reaction. "Heard about that trouble all the way in Bitter Creek." Catherine's rocking continued at the same steady pace. "Yes, terrible tragedy. Poor James and his family. This valley's always been peaceful until recently. Seems like trouble finds its way everywhere these days." "Indeed it does," Jackson agreed, his voice sympathetic while his eyes remained coldly analytical. "A widow living alone in such an isolated spot must give you cause for concern." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The Lord provides, Catherine replied simply, and Rebecca is a comfort to me in my old age. Rebecca returned with coffee, her movements carefully controlled as she placed cups before the men. If she noticed how Levi's eyes lingered inappropriately on her figure, she gave no sign. Jackson, however, remained focused entirely on Catherine, studying her with the intensity of a predator assessing potential prey. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, setting his untouched coffee aside, "I'll be direct with you. Times are hard, and men like us look for opportunities where we can find them. We've heard stories about a widow in these parts who seems unusually comfortable despite her isolation." The air in the room seemed to thicken with tension. Catherine's rocking chair creaked steadily, her aged face revealing nothing. "Is that so?" she replied mildly. "How interesting what tales will spread. I'm afraid you'll find nothing but modest comfort here, just what my husband's pension and good management provide." Levi, less patient than Jackson, stood suddenly and moved to the fireplace mantel, picking up a small carved wooden box that sat there. "Then you won't mind if we have a look at what's so important it needs to be kept in such a fine container." Catherine's rocking stopped. The abrupt silence seemed to fill the room like a physical presence. "Young man," she said, her voice still carrying the quaver of age but now underlaid with something harder, "I suggest you put that down. My husband's war mementos have no value to anyone but me." Levi's laugh was ugly as he shook the box, hearing something rattle inside. "Sounds like valuable mementos to me, old woman." From the direction of the barn came the sudden crack of a gunshot, followed quickly by a second. Jackson's head snapped toward the sound, his hand dropping instinctively to his holster. The man who had been standing watch outside, Vern, spun toward the noise, his own weapon half drawn, preparing for trouble. Inside the house, no one moved for a long, stretched moment. Then Catherine Blackwood smiled, a smile that transformed her face from that of a kindly old widow into something altogether more dangerous. "I was hoping we could avoid this," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong. All traces of quaver gone. "But men like you never could take a hint." Jackson's hand flashed toward his gun, but before he could clear leather, Catherine moved with a speed that seemed impossible for her apparent age. The sewing needle in her hand came up and twisted, revealing itself to be not a simple tool at all, but the disguised handle of a narrow, wicked blade that had been concealed along her forearm. By the time Jackson's revolver was halfway drawn, he found himself staring at the blade, now positioned with deadly precision near his throat. Levi, momentarily frozen by the transformation he was witnessing, recovered quickly and started to swing the wooden box toward Rebecca, intending to use it as a weapon. The young woman, however, was no longer where she had been standing. In the instant of distraction provided by the gunshots from the barn, she had moved to the position they had practiced dozens of times, the Winchester appearing in her hands as if by magic. "I wouldn't," she said quietly, her gun aimed steadily at Levi's chest. "I'm a better shot than I look." Outside, Vern stood indecisively on the porch, torn between investigating the shots from the barn and whatever was happening inside the house. His hesitation proved costly as the front door burst open, revealing the tableau inside. The elderly widow, standing straight and tall, a blade held with the easy confidence of someone intimately familiar with its use, while the young woman covered Levi with a rifle she clearly knew how to handle. "Drop it, boy," Catherine called to him, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Whatever you're thinking, it's not worth dying for." Inside the house, Jackson Corvus's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, The transformation he was witnessing triggered a memory, an old wanted poster he'd seen in a Dakota City Marshal's office years ago, showing a woman with piercing eyes and a confident smile. A woman the poster had named as Catherine "Red Cat" Morgan, leader of the most successful gang of bank and train robbers the Dakota Territory had ever known. "Can't be," he whispered, his hand frozen halfway to his gun. "Red Catherine died in that shootout at Gallows Creek. Everyone knows that." Catherine's smile widened, revealing teeth too perfect for a frontier widow. "Everyone knows a lot of things, Mr. Corvus. Doesn't make them true." "Red Catherine Morgan," Jackson Corvus breathed, the name emerging with a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. The woman who stole $40,000 in railroad payroll from the Western Union Express and vanished without a trace. Catherine's knife remained rock steady, her transformation from stooped elderly widow to commanding presence complete. The years had lined her face and silvered her hair, but her eyes now revealed the sharp intelligence and unwavering resolve that had once made her the most successful outlaw leader in the territory. "That was a lifetime ago," she replied, her voice carrying none of the quaver it had held minutes earlier. "I left that name behind in '78. Outside, Vern remained frozen, his inexperience showing in his inability to decide on a course of action. The silence from the barn, following those two shots, suggested Silas and Mitch had encountered something unexpected and likely fatal. Inside, Levi Blackwood's survival instincts warred with his pride, the wooden box still clutched in his hands. As he measured the distance to Rebecca, calculating whether he could use the heavy object as a weapon before she pulled the trigger. "I wouldn't," Rebecca advised calmly, reading his intentions. "Mrs. Blackwood taught me to shoot center mass. Very little chance of missing at this range." "Listen to the girl," Catherine added, her attention never wavering from Jackson. "She's a quick study. Reminds me of myself at that age." Jackson's mind raced through the stories he'd heard about Red Catherine Morgan's gang, how they'd pulled off 12 major robberies without losing a single member, how they seemed to vanish like ghosts after each job, how federal marshals and Pinkerton detectives had chased them across 5 territories without ever getting close. The gang had been famous not just for their success, but for their unusual composition. Catherine had recruited women as often as men, flouting every convention of the criminal world. "You're supposed to be dead," he said finally. "The papers all reported you died in that shootout with the cavalry at Gallows Creek." Catherine's smile held no warmth. "That's the story the army preferred to tell, rather than admit they'd been outsmarted by a woman." Again. The moment hung suspended in Catherine Blackwood's parlor. Jackson Corvus frozen in disbelief, his brother Levi rigid with tension, and Vern hesitating in the doorway as the summer heat intensified outside, washing away any possibility of easy escape. But before we reveal what happened next, let's consider what forces had brought these individuals to this precise moment of collision. Few people in Dakota Territory in 1895 remembered the name Red Catherine Morgan. 17 years is a long time on the frontier, where legends rise and fall with the changing seasons. Yet, in certain circles, among aging lawmen who'd spent their youth in futile pursuit, in saloons where old-timers spun tales of the West's golden age of outlaws, in the nightmares of railroad executives who'd lost fortunes, the name still carried weight. In an age when female outlaws were typically companions to male criminals, Red Catherine Morgan had been something altogether different. She hadn't merely participated in crimes, she had masterminded them. She hadn't followed a man's lead, she had built her own operation from nothing. And most remarkably, when the inevitable end had seemingly come at Gallows Creek in 1878, she had accomplished what no other notorious outlaw of her era had managed. She had truly disappeared, or so they thought. The Corvus brothers had come hunting. Ghosts and gold, drawn by whispers that had survived decades, rumors of distinctive double-eagle coins occasionally appearing in Redemption Creek, coins that matched those taken in the Western Union Express robbery of 1876, read Catherine's most legendary score. They had come expecting to find, at most, some connection to a long-dead outlaw, perhaps a relative who had inherited ill-gotten gains. Instead, they had found the legend herself, very much alive and still dangerously capable despite her advancing years. What Jackson Corvus couldn't know, as he stared at the transformed elderly woman before him, was that Catherine had spent 17 years preparing for this exact moment, the day when her past would inevitably catch up to her. The carefully constructed identity as Widow Catherine Blackwood, the strategic defenses built into her seemingly modest homestead, the contingency plans rehearsed with Rebecca, all of it designed for when, not if, someone came looking for Red Catherine Morgan or her legendary gold. "Put your weapons on the floor," Catherine commanded, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once led 24 men and women through the most dangerous and successful robberies in Western history. Slowly, and then step back, Jackson's eyes darted to his brother, seeking direction. Levi gave an almost imperceptible nod, and both men carefully removed their revolvers, placing them on the wooden floorboards. "Vern, come inside and close the door," Catherine continued. "Rebecca, keep your aim steady." The youngest Corvus brother complied, his face pale as he realized the magnitude of their miscalculation. What had seemed an easy opportunity, an isolated homestead, an elderly widow, rumors of hidden wealth, had transformed into a deadly standoff with one of the most notorious outlaws the West had ever known. "Silas and Mitch?" Jackson asked, his voice betraying minimal emotion despite the circumstances. "They won't be joining us," Catherine replied evenly. "My arrangements in the barn are quite effective." Rebecca maintained her position, the Winchester, rifle steady in her hands as she covered all three brothers. Despite her youth, there was nothing inexperienced in her stance or expression. In the 2 years she had lived with Catherine, she had absorbed not just shooting skills, but the calm focus necessary to face lethal confrontation without panic. "Mrs. Blackwood, or should I say, Miss Morgan," Jackson began, his composure returning, as the initial shock faded. "It seems we've significantly misunderstood the situation here." Catherine's smile was cold as winter. "No, Mr. Corvus. You understood the situation perfectly well. You came to rob a widow you believed defenseless. The only misunderstanding was about which of us was the predator and which the prey." She gestured toward the kitchen chairs with her free hand, the blade never wavering in the other. "Sit, all of you. We have matters to discuss." As the Corvus brothers moved toward the chairs, Catherine maintained a careful distance. Decades of survival instincts prevented her from making elementary mistakes despite her apparent advantage. Even disarmed, 3 fit men posed a significant threat to an elderly woman if they chose to act desperately. "Rebecca, retrieve the rope from the storage chest," Catherine instructed, never taking her eyes off the brothers. The young woman backed carefully toward the hallway, maintaining her aim until she reached the chest with practiced efficiency. She retrieved a coil of rope, while keeping the Winchester trained on the seated men. "Bind them," Catherine directed. "Wrists first, then ankles to the chair legs." Jackson Corvus watched the proceedings with calculating eyes. Unlike his brothers, whose expressions betrayed anger and fear in varying measures, Jackson's face revealed the analytical mind that had made him the leader of their small but effective criminal operation. "You must be quite a teacher," he observed, as Rebecca expertly secured Vern's wrists. "The girl handles that rope like she's been tying up men for years." "Rebecca has many talents," Catherine replied coolly. "Some taught by me, others developed through her own remarkable intellect. She's been an excellent student and a better companion." Once all 3 brothers were securely bound, Catherine moved to the window, peering out toward the barn. The summer heat had intensified, waves of it, visible above the dusty yard. Perfect weather for concealing whatever had transpired with the other Corvus brothers. "Now then," she said, turning back to her captives, "let's address why you're really here." Jackson straightened in his chair, wincing slightly as the ropes bit into his wrists. "As I said, we heard rumors—" "Stop!" Catherine cut him off. "I've spent 17 years listening for certain kinds of whispers, Mr. Corvus. The specific ones that might indicate my past was catching up to me. So tell me exactly what brought you to my door." For a moment, it seemed Jackson might continue, with evasions, but something in Catherine's unwavering gaze convinced him of the futility of deception. "Gold Eagles," he said finally. "From the Western Union job of 76, a merchant in Bitter Creek has been receiving them occasionally from a customer who trades at the general store in Redemption Creek. Always the same vintage, always in excellent condition." Catherine nodded, slightly unsurprised. "Samuel Winters drinks Kentucky bourbon, plays fair at poker, talks too much when he's had 3 glasses instead of 2. The accuracy of her assessment confirmed what Jackson had suspected. Catherine Morgan had maintained a level of awareness about her surroundings that went far beyond what one would expect from a reclusive widow. She hadn't just been hiding, she'd been watching, gathering information, assessing threats long before they fully materialized. "And you thought to follow this trail to its source," Catherine continued. "Find the legendary gold that Red Catherine supposedly disappeared with after Gallows Creek, a reasonable plan under different circumstances." Vern Corvus, the youngest of the brothers, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We didn't come to hurt nobody," he protested, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of the Missouri borderlands. "Just figured if someone had connection to old outlaw days, might be willing to share information for the right price." Catherine's laugh held no humor. "Information at gunpoint is rarely given freely, young man. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending your intentions were anything but predatory." Rebecca had taken up position near the fireplace, her rifle still trained on the brothers, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. The transformation in the young woman since Catherine's true identity had been revealed was subtle but significant, her posture straighter, her movements more deliberate, her eyes constantly assessing potential threats and advantages. She had clearly learned more from Catherine than just how to shoot. "What now?" Jackson asked, the practical question cutting through the tension. "You've captured us quite effectively, I'll grant you that, but what follows? We're not exactly in a position to trouble you further." The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. All those present understood the frontier reality. Dead men told no tales. Disposing of the Corvus brothers would be the most efficient way to preserve Catherine's carefully constructed life. "That depends entirely on you," Catherine replied, taking a seat in her rocking chair opposite them, the blade now resting casually across her lap. "Unlike some, I've never killed without necessity." Jackson's eyebrows rose slightly. "The Red Catherine I heard about left bodies from Texas to Montana." "The Red Catherine you heard about was largely a creation of dime novels and sensationalist newspapers," Catherine countered. "They needed a villain spectacular enough to sell papers, and a woman outlaw leading men was too delicious a story to leave unembellished." She rocked slowly, the familiar motion at odds with the extraordinary conversation. "Yes, people died during our operations, when they chose to fight rather than surrender, when they made foolish decisions in the heat of the moment. But we never set out to kill. It was inefficient and unnecessarily complicated what were, at heart, business transactions." "Business transactions?" Levi repeated incredulously. "You stole over $80,000 across 5 territories." Catherine's Rocking continued, steady and unhurried, from railroad companies that stole land from settlers using corrupt courts and private militias, from banks that foreclosed on family farms during droughts while their owners dined in St. Louis mansions, from mining companies that worked men to death for pennies while shareholders grew fat on their labor. Her voice had taken on a harder edge, revealing glimpses of the passion that had once driven a young woman to choose a life outside the law, rather than accept the injustices she witnessed. "I'm not seeking absolution, Mr. Corvus. I made my choices, with open eyes, and accepted the consequences they carried. But don't presume to lecture me on morality when you came here to rob an old woman." Jackson studied her with renewed interest. "You're not what I expected," he admitted finally. "Few things are, in my experience," Catherine replied. "Now let's return to the question at hand. What am I to do with you and your brothers?" The summer heat continued its assault, filling the silence that followed. Rebecca glanced toward the window where the afternoon was beginning to wane, the sun's angle shifting toward the western mountains. Catherine followed her gaze, making a quick calculation. "It's too late to ride for the sheriff," she observed. "Even if the trails weren't baking in this heat, night travel in this country is a fool's errand with the mountain lions coming down to the lowlands this time of year." "Sheriff Wade's out of town regardless," Rebecca added. "Took a prisoner to Fort Pierre 3 days ago. Won't be back until week's end at earliest." This exchange of practical information, delivered with the casual familiarity of people accustomed to assessing tactical situations together, revealed much about the relationship between the two women. Despite their age difference, they operated as partners, each contributing to their shared security. "Then it seems we'll be enjoying each other's company until morning at least," Catherine concluded, her gaze returning to the Corvus brothers. "Which gives us time to consider all our options." "Carefully." Jackson's expression remained carefully neutral, though his eyes continued their assessment of the room, looking for weaknesses or opportunities. "And our brothers in the barn will receive appropriate attention?" "Once we've settled matters here," Catherine assured him, though her tone suggested they shouldn't nurture excessive hope regarding the condition of Silas and Mitch. "You said you don't kill without necessity," Vern pointed out, a tremor in his voice, betraying his fear despite his attempt at bravado. "What makes this necessary?" Catherine's rocking slowed as she considered the young man. Unlike his older brothers, whose hardened expressions spoke of years spent outside the law, Vern retained something almost boyish beneath his rough exterior. He couldn't be more than 22 or 23, likely following his brother's lead rather than charting his own criminal course. "That remains to be determined," she replied finally. "By your actions as much as mine." She gestured toward Rebecca. "Check on our other guests, but be careful. The barn provides good cover for unexpected movements." Rebecca nodded, moving toward the door with the practiced caution of someone well-trained in tactical awareness. She paused at the threshold, glancing back at Catherine. A wordless communication passed between them, years of trust condensed into a single look. 10 minutes, Catherine said simply. "Any longer, and I'll come looking." As Rebecca slipped out into the summer heat, Levi strained against his bonds, testing their security. The ropes held firm, expertly tied with knots that tightened rather than loosened with movement. "She won't make it to the barn," he predicted grimly. "Silas and Mitch aren't as easily taken as you seem to think." Catherine's smile was thin. "Your confidence is misplaced, Mr. Corvus. Silas never saw what hit him, and Mitch had just enough time to fire once before my arrangements rendered him equally incapacitated." Jackson watched this exchange with calculating eyes. "You seem remarkably calm for someone whose carefully constructed life has just been exposed, Miss Morgan." Catherine's gaze shifted back to him, assessing. "Mr. Corvus, I've spent 17 years preparing for this eventuality. Did you think I wouldn't have contingency plans for when, not if, but when, someone finally connected Catherine Blackwood to Red Catherine Morgan?" The implication hung in the air. Whatever happened next had been anticipated long ago by a woman who had survived decades as one of the most hunted outlaws in American history. The Corvus brothers had walked into something far more complex than a simple robbery opportunity. They had stumbled into the final chapter of a legend, a chapter Catherine Morgan had been writing in her mind for 17 years. As lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white light for an instant, the full situation became clear to Jackson Corvus. They weren't just captives. They were now players in a drama decades in the making, pawns in a game whose rules and boundaries Catherine had established long before they arrived. "What happens at dawn?" he asked, the practical question cutting through speculation. Catherine's rocking chair creaked softly as she leaned forward, her eyes reflecting the lamplight with an intensity that belied her years. "That, Mr. Corvus, depends entirely on what I learn about you and your brothers between now and then." The storm that had been building throughout the afternoon finally broke as midnight approached. Rain lashed against the windows of Catherine's homestead, and thunder rolled across the valley like distant artillery fire. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of tension as captor and captives measured each other across the lamplight. Catherine had moved the three Corvus brothers to the kitchen, where they remained bound to sturdy chairs, but could at least be more comfortable than in the parlor's straight-backed seats. Rebecca had prepared a simple meal: cornbread, jerky and coffee, which she offered to the brothers after Catherine had inspected it. This small courtesy extended to men who had come to rob them spoke volumes about the code by which Catherine still operated, even 17 years removed from her outlaw days. "You should eat," Catherine advised Jackson, noting his hesitation. "Tomorrow will require clear heads regardless of its outcome." Jackson studied the offered food before nodding to his brothers. They ate awkwardly, hands still bound, but with enough slack to manage the simple fare. Vern, the youngest, devoured his portion with the enthusiasm of youth, while Levi picked suspiciously at each bite. Jackson ate methodically, his eyes never leaving Catherine as he chewed. "Now then," Catherine said once they had finished, settling into a chair across from them with the ease of someone accustomed to taking control of difficult situations, "I think it's time we understood each other better. You know who I was. I'd like to know who you are beyond the obvious." Jackson straightened slightly, the natural leader of the three. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, though his scarred face and watchful eyes revealed a hard path to that position. The jagged mark that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth had the distinctive pattern of a knife wound, one that had healed poorly due to inadequate medical attention. "What's to understand?" he countered. "We're businessmen who made a significant miscalculation today." Catherine's laugh held no humor. "Businessmen? An interesting euphemism for what you do. But let's start with basics. The Corvus brothers, Jackson, Levi, Silas, Mitch and Vern, operating primarily in the Dakota and Montana territories for the past 4 years. Known for well-planned robberies with minimal violence unless resistance is encountered. Rumored to have connections to certain corrupt officials who ensure your activities receive less attention than they might otherwise." The accuracy of her assessment clearly surprised the brothers, though Jackson maintained his composure. "You've been paying attention. As I said, I've spent 17 years listening for certain kinds of whispers," Catherine replied. "Your operation has been careful enough to avoid significant attention from federal marshals, but careless enough that tales of your exploits reach even a reclusive widow's ears eventually. This revelation that Catherine had monitored criminal activities throughout the region from her isolated homestead suggested resources and connections far beyond what anyone might expect from a retired outlaw. She hadn't merely been hiding. She had maintained an intelligence network that kept her informed of potential threats long before they materialized. Jackson Corvus seemed to reach a decision. If we're to have this conversation honestly, let's have it honestly. We are what we are, men who take what we want and make no apologies for it. The West is changing, civilization encroaching year by year. The opportunities for men like us grow more limited with each new railroad and telegraph line. So you came hunting legends, Catherine observed, the last great score before progress closes all the doors. Jackson inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the accuracy of her assessment. The Western Union gold has never been recovered. 40,000 in double eagles, untraceable and negotiable anywhere. A fortune that would allow men to establish legitimate enterprises, perhaps in places where questions about origins are asked less frequently. Mexico, Catherine suggested, or perhaps Canada, somewhere the Corvus name isn't connected to robbery and murder. A slight tightening around Jackson's eyes was the only indication that her insight had struck home. Plans change based on circumstances, he replied carefully. Currently our circumstances seem rather limited. Catherine studied Jackson Corvus with the practiced eye of someone who had once evaluated potential gang members, separating those with genuine talent from those merely drawn to the romance of outlaw life. Jackson, despite his current predicament, displayed the calculated thinking and psychological control that marked capable leadership. "Tell me about your brothers," she said, changing tack abruptly. "Each man comes to this life through his own path." Jackson hesitated, clearly weighing the strategic value of personal disclosure against potential disadvantages. Finally, he shrugged slightly. "Levi and I were born to it. Our father rode with Quantrill during the war before establishing his own operations in Missouri. He taught us the trade from childhood, how to assess targets, plan approaches, evaluate risks. Silas and Mitch joined us after the drought of '89 took their family ranch in Wyoming. Vern is our half-brother from our father's second marriage. He's been with us only 2 years. This family history, delivered with matter-of-fact precision, illuminated much about the Corvus operation. Unlike many outlaw gangs that formed haphazardly around charismatic leaders, theirs was essentially a family business built on blood ties and shared experience." Levi Corvus shifted in his chair, the movement drawing attention to his distinctive appearance. Unlike Jackson's weathered ruggedness, Levi possessed a deceptively refined quality, handsome features, carefully trimmed mustache, and the bearing of someone who might pass for a businessman or gambler in more civilized settings. At 37, he showed fewer physical signs of their harsh lifestyle, suggesting he played a role that required a more respectable appearance. "Jackson forgets to mention my particular contributions," Levi remarked, speaking directly to Catherine for the first time since their meal began. "I handle our intelligence gathering and public interactions. Banks and businesses tend to be more forthcoming with well-dressed gentlemen inquiring about investment opportunities than with obvious roughnecks." The hint of cultured accent in his speech confirmed Catherine's assessment. Levi was the face of their operation, the one who could move through respectable society, gathering the information necessary for successful robberies. "The reconnaissance man," Catherine acknowledged. "Every successful operation needs one. In my day, that role was filled by Elizabeth Townsend, a judge's daughter from St. Louis, who could charm information from the most tight-lipped officials, while appearing to do nothing more than attend to social obligations." This rare personal detail about the Red Catherine gang's operations seemed to intrigue the brothers. Even Jackson leaned forward slightly, his interest in the legendary outlaw. temporarily overcoming his concern about their current predicament. "And what happened to Miss Townsend?" he asked. After Gallows Creek, a shadow passed across Catherine's face, the first crack in her composed facade. "Elizabeth died 2 years before Gallows Creek. Tuberculosis took her in the winter of '76, a remarkably mundane end for someone who had escaped shotgun blasts and Pinkerton agents for nearly a decade." The genuine regret in her voice revealed an aspect of Catherine Morgan that contrasted with her legendary status. Not just a calculating outlaw leader, but a woman who had formed deep bonds with her companions. Vern Corvus, who had remained largely silent throughout the exchanges, spoke up suddenly. "Did you really recruit women into your gang? The stories say you had almost as many female members as men." His youthful curiosity seemed genuine, suggesting that despite riding with his brothers, Vern retained a certain innocence about their profession, perhaps even a touch of the romanticism that dime novels had attached to the great outlaws of earlier decades. "Not as many as the stories claim," Catherine replied, her expression softening slightly as she regarded the young man. "But yes, several of my most valuable associates were women. In that era, women were largely invisible to law enforcement, or at least women of certain appearances and apparent social positions were. A well-dressed lady could observe bank security procedures for weeks without raising suspicion, while a man loitering for even a day might be questioned. This strategic insight, leveraging society's blindness toward women to criminal advantage, revealed the innovative thinking that had made the Red Catherine gang so successful in their era. Catherine Morgan hadn't merely been brave or lucky. She had recognized and exploited systemic weaknesses that her male counterparts overlooked. "And what about the brothers in the barn?" Catherine asked, shifting attention back to the immediate situation. "Tell me about Silas and Mitch." Jackson's expression hardened slightly at the reminder of his separated siblings. "Silas is the strongest among us, former prizefighter in Kansas City before the law became too interested in his activities, simplifies problems with his fists when diplomacy fails. And frequently before diplomacy has been fully attempted," Levi added with evident disapproval. "His impatience has complicated more than one operation." Catherine nodded, unsurprised. Every gang had its muscle, the members whose primary value lay in physical intimidation rather than strategic contribution. In her own operation, that role had been filled by the Donovan cousins, Irish immigrants, whose imposing size had often precluded the need for actual violence. Few bank managers required further persuasion when confronted with men who stood nearly 6 feet 4 inches tall. "Mitch is our tracker and scout," Jackson continued. "Learned his skills from a Lakota guide during his time with a hunting outfit. Can read sign better than most Indians and knows territory from the Minnesota border to the Montana Badlands." This description completed Catherine's understanding of the Corvus operation. A well-balanced team with complementary skills bound by family ties that prevented the internal betrayals that often destroyed other outlaw gangs. Jackson provided leadership and planning. Levi handled intelligence and public interactions. Silas offered physical enforcement. Mitch contributed wilderness skills and tracking, while Vern, still learning, likely served as an extra gun and general. "Assistant, a capable group," Catherine acknowledged, "which makes your decision to target this particular homestead all the more interesting. Experienced men like yourselves should have recognized the unusual aspects of my property, the strategic positioning, the excessive security features, the careful maintenance of sightlines. Yet you proceeded as if approaching a standard widow's farm." Her observation cut to the heart of the matter, what had driven competent criminals to overlook obvious warning signs. Jackson and Levi exchanged a glance that suggested this question touched on internal disagreements. Mitch raised concerns, Jackson admitted finally. "Noted several unusual features during our preliminary observation. I overruled him." "Why?" Catherine pressed, genuinely curious about the tactical miscalculation. Jackson's scarred face revealed little, but his words carried the weight of uncommon honesty. Because the potential reward seemed worth the risk. 40,000 in gold. Eagles would allow us to establish legitimate businesses, far from territories where our names carry reputations. With civilization encroaching year by year, the window for men of our profession grows smaller. We needed one final score significant enough to build new lives upon. This frank acknowledgement of their motivations, not mere greed, but a recognition of changing times, suggested a self-awareness that Catherine hadn't anticipated. The Corvus brothers weren't simply predators. They were men who recognized that their way of life was ending and sought an exit strategy, however misguided their methods. A sentiment I understand better than you might imagine, Catherine said after a thoughtful pause. It was similar reasoning that led me to establish this homestead after Gallows Creek. The west of 1878 was already changing from the frontier. I had known in the 1860s, telegraph lines connected previously isolated settlements. Railroads brought law enforcement within days rather than weeks of crime scenes, and newspapers spread descriptions and warnings with unprecedented speed. Rebecca, who had been maintaining a watchful position near the door throughout these exchanges, spoke for the first time in over an hour. "The storm's intensity is decreasing," she observed, her practical assessment cutting through the increasingly philosophical conversation. "First light will come in about 4 hours." Catherine nodded, acknowledging both the information and its implications. "Thank you, Rebecca. We should all get some rest before decisions must be made." Jackson straightened in his chair, ignoring the discomfort of his bonds. "And what decisions might those be, Miss Morgan? Our fate remains conspicuously undiscussed." Catherine rose from her chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested sudden changes after decades of hard use. Despite this concession to age, her posture remained commanding, her eyes sharp with intelligence undimmed by her 63 years. "Several options present themselves," she replied evenly, "none without complications. Sheriff Wade returns in 3 days. Delivering you to him would be the most straightforward approach, though it would inevitably raise questions about how an elderly widow and her niece managed to capture 5 experienced outlaws. The implication hung in the air. Turning the Corvus brothers over to legal authorities would likely expose Catherine's own identity, unraveling the life she had carefully constructed over 2 decades. "Alternatives exist, of course," she continued, her tone matter-of-fact rather than threatening. "Remote locations offer privacy for permanent solutions to temporary problems. My property includes several areas where soil composition facilitates both digging and subsequent vegetation growth. This calm reference to the possibility of execution and burial should have been chilling, yet Catherine delivered it with such practical detachment that it seemed more like a farmer discussing crop rotation than a former outlaw contemplating murder. "Or," Jackson prompted, correctly sensing that Catherine had not finished outlining possibilities. "Or arrangements might be reached," she concluded, "terms that would allow all parties to pursue their interests with minimal interference. My continued peaceful existence here, your departure toward whatever futures you envision for yourselves. This third option, a negotiated resolution rather than either legal consequences or frontier justice, revealed Catherine's pragmatic approach to conflict resolution. Despite her legendary status and the brothers' criminal intent, she remained open to solutions that avoided unnecessary bloodshed. "Such arrangements would require trust," Jackson observed, skepticism evident in his tone. "A commodity in short supply under current circumstances." Catherine's smile held no warmth. "Trust is indeed rare in our profession, Mr. Corvus, but effective Mechanisms exist to enforce agreements even among those who might otherwise be inclined to betrayal. With that cryptic statement, she nodded to Rebecca, who moved toward the brothers with a small bottle and cloth in hand. "A mild sedative," Catherine explained as Rebecca prepared to apply the dampened cloth to Vern's face. "Nothing harmful, merely enough to ensure you remain where placed until morning. We all need rest, and I prefer not to have my sleep disturbed by ill-advised escape attempts." Vern's eyes widened with alarm, but before he could protest, Rebecca pressed the cloth firmly over his nose and mouth. His struggles lasted only seconds before his eyes rolled back and his head slumped forward. "Dreams without complications," Catherine observed as Rebecca moved to repeat the process with Levi. "Something we all might wish for in different circumstances." Jackson watched his brothers succumb to the sedative without resistance, recognizing the futility of struggle against their bonds. As Rebecca approached him with the cloth, he met Catherine's gaze directly. "You've led an extraordinary life, Red Cat," he said, using her legendary nickname for the first time. "I wonder if you'll allow me the opportunity to hear more of it." Assuming morning brings decisions in our favor, Catherine's expression remained unreadable as she considered this request. Part flattery, part genuine curiosity, delivered by a man facing an uncertain fate at her hands. "Sleep well, Mr. Corvus," she replied simply. "Morning brings clarity to even the most complex situations." As the cloth descended over Jackson's face, the last thing he saw was Catherine Morgan silhouetted against the lamplight. The legendary Red Catherine, emerging fully from beneath the careful disguise of Catherine Blackwood, a transformation 17 years in the making, precipitated by his own misjudgment and ambition. Outside, the storm began to subside, the winds diminishing to an occasional moan as the worst of the tempest moved eastward across the Dakota plains. By dawn, the skies would clear, bringing sunshine and decision to Redemption Creek and to the unusual gathering within Catherine Blackwood's farmhouse. Long after the Corvus brothers had succumbed to the sedative, Catherine Morgan sat alone in her parlor, a single lamp burning low as the storm gradually subsided outside. Rebecca had finally relented to Catherine's insistence that she get some rest, though the young woman had extracted a promise that Catherine would wake her in 2 hours to take the watch. In this rare moment of solitude, Catherine allowed herself to do something she seldom permitted. She revisited the past. From beneath a loose floorboard near the fireplace, concealed by a heavy rug, she retrieved a small wooden box inlaid with silver. The box had been her one indulgence when establishing her new identity, a single object carried from her previous life into her careful anonymity as Catherine Blackwood. The key hung on a chain around her neck, never removed even when bathing. With practiced movements, she unlocked the box and spread its contents on the small table beside her rocking chair. A collection of faded newspaper clippings, a folded wanted poster, a tarnished silver pocket watch, and most significantly, a leather-bound journal whose pages had yellowed with age. The wanted poster, unfolded carefully to prevent further damage along its well-worn creases, revealed an artist's rendering of a woman in her early 30s. Despite the primitive printing techniques of the era, the image captured a striking figure, high cheekbones, determined eyes, and a confident half-smile that suggested the subject found something privately amusing about having her likeness distributed. By authorities, wanted dead or alive, Catherine Red Cat Morgan, the bold text proclaimed, for robbery, theft of government property, conspiracy, and aiding known criminals. $2,000 reward. The sum, extraordinary for the 1870s, testified to how desperately law enforcement had wanted to capture the legendary female outlaw. Catherine studied the image with the detached curiosity of someone examining a distant relative, rather than a younger version of herself. The decades separating Red Catherine Morgan from Catherine Blackwood had transformed her physically, silver hair replacing the vibrant auburn waves that had earned her nickname, wrinkles mapping a lifetime of expression across once smooth skin, hands gnarled by both arthritis and the practical work of maintaining a frontier homestead. Yet the eyes remained unchanged, perceptive, alert, and carrying a hint of the sardonic humor that had made her both a charismatic leader and a frustrating quarry for those who pursued her across 5 territories for nearly a decade. Catherine turned her attention to the journal, opening it to an entry dated May 12, 1876, 2 months before the Western Union Express robbery that the Corvus brothers had come seeking. The handwriting was precise and compact, making efficient use of space in a manner that reflected the writer's methodical mind. Reconnaissance of Western Union route completed. Thomas confirms payroll shipment scheduled for July 8th. Approximately $40,000 in gold eagles to be transported from St. Louis to Fort Abraham Lincoln via the northern stage line. Security arrangements standard for valuables. 2 company guards plus messenger with coach shotgun. No military escort planned despite territory unrest. Elizabeth suggests ambush at Cedar Creek Crossing, where recent rains have damaged the bridge, necessitating reduced speed. Jacob's concern about Lakota scouting parties in the area valid but manageable with proper timing. Will require precise coordination and complete telegraph interruption to prevent advanced warning to Fort Pierre. Decision: proceed with planning. Elizabeth to obtain precise shipment manifests through courthouse contacts. Daniel and William to survey Creek Crossing for optimal positioning. Samuel to procure necessary equipment from Sioux City supplier. Preliminary arrangements to be completed by June 15th for final review. This clinical assessment of what would become the most famous robbery in Dakota history revealed nothing of moral quandary or concern for potential consequences, only the dispassionate planning of a tactical mind applying itself to a complex problem. The entry might as easily have been written by a military commander planning a campaign as by an outlaw leader organizing a major theft. Catherine turned to a later entry dated July 11th, 1876, 3 days after the robbery. Operation executed according to plan with minimal complications. Telegraph lines cut at 11:24 p.m., delaying alert until repair at approximately 5:30 a.m. Stage arrived at crossing at 12:17 a.m. on schedule. Bridge warning properly observed by driver, reducing speed to walking pace as anticipated. Boarding accomplished without incident from North Embankment. Guards subdued, using chloroform as planned, no casualties. Messenger initially resistant, but cooperative after demonstration of overwhelming force. All strongboxes secured and removed via pack horses to Wolf Creek Rendezvous. Team divided as established in contingency plan. 3 groups of 3 taking separate routes to secondary gathering point at abandoned Edwards homestead. Minor injury. To Daniel, bullet grazed to left shoulder when messenger produced hidden derringer. Wound cleaned and bandaged, no significant blood loss. Sarah administering tincture to manage pain during travel. Estimated total: $38,750 in gold eagles, approximately 1,150 coins. Weight distribution per person appropriately managed and successfully transported to holding location for 6 months. Cooling period as established in protocol. No pursuit detected as of this writing. Telegraph reports indicate confusion about direction of travel, with possessed dispatched both north and south along stage line. Misdirection efforts appear successful. The precise account, devoid of both self-congratulation and concern about legal consequences, illuminated the methodical approach that had made the Red Catherine gang so successful. Where other outlaws relied on brute force and intimidation, Catherine Morgan had applied strategic planning and intelligence gathering worthy of a military campaign. Most tellingly, the entry reflected her operational principle of avoiding casualties, whenever possible. Not from moral compunction alone, but from the practical recognition that dead bodies created more determined pursuit than simple property theft. Catherine closed the journal, her fingers lingering on its worn leather cover. These pages contained the only accurate record of the Red Catherine Gang's operations, a stark contrast to the sensationalized accounts that had appeared in newspapers and dime novels of the era. She had maintained the journal throughout her outlaw years, recording each operation with the same dispassionate precision, creating an archive that would have been devastatingly incriminating had it ever fallen into law enforcement hands. Why had she kept it? The question had occurred to her many times over the decades, especially in the early years of establishing her new identity, when discovery would have meant certain execution. The journal represented an inexplicable risk for a woman otherwise so carefully calculated in her actions. Perhaps it was vanity, a desire to preserve the reality of her accomplishments against the distortions of popular mythology. Perhaps it was a form of reckoning, an honest accounting of actions that could neither be undone nor fully atoned for. Or perhaps, most simply, it was a connection to the woman she had been before necessity transformed her into the respectable widow of Redemption Creek. A soft sound from the kitchen drew Catherine's attention back to the present. Rising with the careful movements of age, she secured the journal and clippings in their box, returned it to its hiding place beneath the floorboard, and moved silently toward the source of the noise. Vern Corvus was regaining consciousness, his head lolling as he struggled against the lingering effects of the sedative. Unlike his brothers, who remained deeply unconscious, the younger man's system had apparently processed the drug more quickly. His eyes, still unfocused, tracked slowly around the kitchen until they settled on Catherine standing in the doorway. "Water," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine studied him for a moment, then retrieved a cup from the sideboard and filled it from the pitcher. She approached cautiously, holding the cup to his lips while maintaining sufficient distance to prevent any sudden movement on his part from reaching her. Vern drank greedily, water spilling down his chin in his eagerness to relieve his parched throat. When he had finished, Catherine stepped back, assessing him with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats. "Thank you," he managed, his voice stronger though still raspy from the drug. "You're welcome," Catherine replied simply. "The effects will fade completely within the hour. Your brothers will likely remain unconscious until dawn." Vern nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. "Why am I awake when they're not?" A reasonable question suggesting a mind that remains analytical despite your circumstances. Catherine observed. Younger metabolism perhaps, or possibly a higher tolerance for soporifics. The body responds differently based on previous exposures. The young man's expression revealed surprise at her scientific knowledge, another incongruity in this elderly widow who had proven to be so much more than she appeared. "How did you become Red Catherine?" he asked suddenly, the directness of youth, cutting through pretense. "The stories never say where you came from, only what you did." Catherine considered him thoughtfully. Of all the Corvus brothers, Vern alone had shown genuine curiosity beyond their immediate circumstances, interest in the person behind the legend rather than merely the gold they had come seeking. Whether this reflected youthful romanticism or deeper insight into human complexity remained unclear. "A question seldom asked, even by those who hunted me for years," she observed, settling into a chair opposite him, but maintaining a cautious distance. They were content to chase the outlaw without wondering how she came to exist. Vern waited, his expression open with genuine interest, despite his bound condition. Something in his unguarded curiosity reminded Catherine of another young person. Long ago, a version of herself before circumstances had hardened her into the woman who would become Red Catherine Morgan. I was born Catherine Elizabeth Walsh in 1832, she began, surprising herself with the decision to share this long-buried history, daughter of Reverend James Walsh of Philadelphia. My father was a respected Presbyterian minister, our family, comfortable though far from wealthy. This origin, far removed from the frontier settings most associated with outlaw origins, clearly surprised Vern. The Red Catherine of legend had seemed so intrinsically connected to the Western territories that few had imagined her having roots in Eastern civilization. My mother died when I was 16. Father remarried a year later, a cold woman with little interest in another woman's child. When she bore him a son, my position in the household became increasingly precarious. Catherine paused, lost momentarily. In memories of a life so distant, it sometimes seemed to belong to another person entirely. At 19, I married Thomas Morgan, a surveyor with dreams of the frontier. When Minnesota Territory opened for settlement in 1849, Thomas saw opportunity. Unlike most men, he valued my education and practical mind, sought my counsel in decisions that would shape our future. "Did you find happiness there?" Vern asked. Catherine's smile held little humor. "For a time. We established a small trading post near what would become St. Paul. For 5 years, we prospered as the territory developed. Thomas's surveys were in demand as settlement expanded, and I managed our business affairs with increasing success." Her expression darkened. Then came 1857. The Sioux uprising to the west disrupted trade. Simultaneously, the financial panic that year caused Eastern investors to call in loans. The territorial bank that held our savings collapsed. Thomas went to St. Louis to secure emergency financing from a family connection. On his return journey, the steamboat struck a snag and sank. 42 passengers drowned, including my husband. The bitter edge in her voice revealed that even after nearly 4 decades, the wound of this loss remained unhealed. I spent 2 years attempting to save our business, working within legitimate channels. Petitioned the territorial government for widows' relief, hired attorneys to recover our deposits, even traveled to Washington to meet with federal officials. Each effort met the same response: polite sympathy followed by inaction. This origin story, personal tragedy compounded by institutional indifference, illuminated the foundation upon which Red Catherine Morgan had built her criminal career. Not simple greed or lawlessness, but a profound disillusionment with the system supposedly designed to protect honest citizens. Meanwhile, the banker who had embezzled our deposits and those of 100 other families opened a new financial institution in Dakota Territory. I watched him prosper while I sold our remaining possessions to keep from starving. "So you decided to take justice into your own hands," Vern suggested. Catherine nodded slightly. "Not immediately. First came survival. I worked as a teacher in mining camps, then as a bookkeeper for a freighting company. I learned the territories, observed how money and valuables moved through increasingly organized channels. Most importantly, I watched how power operated on the frontier, how certain men prospered not through honest labor, but through manipulation of emerging systems, often with the complicity of those tasked with enforcing justice." She leaned forward, slightly, her eyes reflecting the intensity that had once made her a natural leader of desperate men and women. The Western territories in the 1860s existed in a state of flux. Enough structure to enable commerce, but insufficient oversight to prevent corruption. The perfect environment for those willing to operate outside conventional boundaries. "When did you become Red Catherine?" Vern asked, clearly captivated despite his circumstances. "The name came later," Catherine replied. My first act of deliberate theft occurred in 1863, 6 years after Thomas's death. The banker who had destroyed our lives was by then operating a stagecoach line that specialized in financial transfers between military outposts. His manager was transporting $3,800 in payroll collections to Fort Ridgely when I intercepted him at a river crossing. The memory brought a faint smile to her lips. A woman alone on the road with an apparently lame horse. The manager stopped to assist, never suspecting that his charitable impulse would cost his employer nearly the exact amount my husband and I had lost in his bank's collapse. This first robbery, small by the standards of her later operations but significant in establishing her course, had been conducted without violence or even direct confrontation, merely clever planning and an understanding of human psychology, qualities that would become hallmarks of the Red Catherine methodology. I expected to feel guilt afterward, Catherine admitted. Instead, I experienced only a profound sense of equilibrium restored. Not complete justice, nothing could return Thomas to me, but a balancing of scales that the legal system had failed to provide. Vern absorbed this revelation with thoughtful consideration. How did you go from that to leading the most successful gang in Dakota history? Necessity and opportunity in equal measure, Catherine explained. That first theft provided resources, but also created complications. Once identified as the culprit, which occurred more quickly than I had anticipated, I could no longer move freely through established communities. I retreated to the margins, connected with others similarly displaced by corrupt systems or personal tragedies. She gestured toward the window where pre-dawn light had begun to soften the darkness. The first actual gang formed organically. 5 of us, each with complementary skills and united by common experiences of injustice. Sarah Donovan had lost her family's Minnesota farmstead to machinations similar to those that destroyed my business. Daniel Cross had been a Union Army scout, blacklisted after reporting supply corruption during the war. These origin stories, personal grievances against powerful interests rather than generalized criminality, revealed the unusual foundation upon which Catherine had built her outlaw career. Where most gangs formed around shared appetites for wealth or violence, the original Red Catherine gang had coalesced around a common perception of systemic failure. We conducted 4 operations that first year, Catherine continued, small by later standards, but carefully planned and executed without casualties. Each target was selected based on connections to the same network of financial manipulation that had protected the banker who ruined me. We weren't random predators. We were calculated responders to specific predation. The distinction she drew between indiscriminate criminality and targeted retribution highlighted the moral framework that had guided her outlaw career. In Catherine's narrative, the Red Catherine gang had been something closer to vigilantes than typical bandits, acting where legal systems had failed rather than simply seeking personal enrichment. The name Red Catherine first appeared in a St. Paul newspaper in 1864, she recalled, a reference to my hair color coupled with what the reporter called cat-like stealth in our methods. We adopted it deliberately thereafter, using it in messages left at robbery sites to connect our actions in public perception. This strategic cultivation of reputation, creating a recognizable brand for their activities, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how public narrative could serve practical purposes. By establishing the Red Catherine identity, Catherine had differentiated her operations from common banditry, creating a distinctive profile that actually assisted in controlling how they were perceived and pursued. By 1866, we had expanded to 12 members and developed the methodologies that later became our signature: extensive reconnaissance, strategic use of both male and female operatives, non-violent approaches whenever possible, and elaborate, escape protocols that involved multiple diverging routes. She glanced toward the window again, noting the strengthening light. Dawn approaches, and with it, decisions that cannot be postponed. Your brothers will awaken soon, and we must all determine what futures emerge from this unexpected collision of past and present. Vern studied her with newfound understanding. The romanticized notion of Red Catherine that had colored dime novel. Accounts had been replaced by something more complex, a woman driven by personal tragedy into calculated criminality, guided by principles that, while outside the law, maintained their own coherent morality. What happened to the banker? He, us suddenly, the man who started all this, did you ever find him? Catherine's expression hardened momentarily, then resolved into something more ambiguous. Harold Winters died in 1867. His office in Fort Pierre burned one night with him inside it. The coroner found evidence suggesting he'd been drinking heavily, likely fell asleep with a lit cigar. A tragic accident that closed many outstanding questions. The careful neutrality of her description left the actual circumstances deliberately ambiguous. Whether Red Catherine Morgan had eventually claimed direct vengeance against the man who destroyed her previous life, or merely witnessed karma's resolution, remained unspoken. You should rest while you can, Catherine advised, rising from her chair with the careful movements of age. The coming hours will require clear minds and careful choices from all of us. As she moved toward the door, Vern called softly after her, "Why tell me all this? Why share your story with someone who came to rob you?" Catherine paused, considering the question with genuine reflection. "Perhaps because in you I see echoes of choices not yet fully made," she replied finally. "The path that led me to become Red Catherine began with righteous anger, but eventually led places I hadn't anticipated. You stand at similar crossroads, following your brothers into a life that may not reflect your true nature." With that cryptic observation, she left him to his thoughts as the first golden light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern sky above Redemption Creek. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a washed-clean world where decisions, made in the coming hours, would determine the fate of both the legendary Red Catherine and the young outlaw whose path had unexpectedly intersected with hers. Dawn broke over Redemption Creek with the pristine clarity that often follows violent storms. The sun's early rays illuminated a landscape transformed, branches scattered across rain-soaked ground, new rivulets carved into the property's eastern slope, and puddles reflecting the brightening sky like scattered mirrors. Inside, Catherine, Blackwood's kitchen, the three Corvus brothers sat in varying states of consciousness. Jackson and Levi had awakened within minutes of each other, both experiencing the disorienting after-effects of the sedative. Vern, having been awake longer, appeared more alert, though the night's revelations seemed to have left him thoughtful and subdued. Catherine stood at the cast-iron stove, preparing coffee with the practiced movements of long habit. Rebecca had gone to check on the other Corvus brothers confined in the barn, carrying a tray with bread, dried beef, and water, practical hospitality even toward those who had come as enemies. "I trust you gentlemen slept well," Catherine remarked, the dry humor reflecting something of the legendary Red Catherine's reputed wit. Now, in full daylight, with no need to maintain her elderly widow facade, her movements had taken on a different quality, still showing the inevitable limitations of age, but without the deliberate fragility she had projected upon the brothers' arrival. Jackson Blackwood, his mind clearing with each passing minute, studied her with narrowed eyes. Remarkable. Hospitality considering the circumstances. Decent treatment of prisoners was another principle that distinguished the Red Catherine gang from common road agents, Catherine replied, pouring the coffee into sturdy mugs. At least according to those dime novels your brother Vern seems familiar with. Vern flushed slightly at this reference to their earlier conversation, avoiding his eldest brother's questioning glance. The dynamics between the brothers had shifted subtly but significantly since their capture, Jackson's authority diminished by his strategic error, Levi's sophistication rendered meaningless in their bound state, and Vern suddenly positioned as someone with potentially valuable insight into their captor. "My brother appears to have had quite the conversation while we were indisposed," Jackson observed, his tone carrying a subtle edge of disapproval. Catherine placed mugs of coffee before each brother, manipulating their bonds enough to allow them limited movement for drinking. Vern asked questions others never bothered to consider about how circumstances shape our choices rather than merely what results from them. This philosophical framing, focusing on the paths that led to current circumstances rather than merely present conditions, reflected the underlying complexity that had always separated Catherine Morgan from typical outlaws. Where most lived entirely in the immediate moment, she had maintained awareness of both historical context and future implications. "And now?" Levi asked, speaking for the first time since awakening. "What choices present themselves this morning?" Catherine took a seat opposite them, her own coffee cradled between hands that showed decades of practical work despite their current cleanliness. "That depends largely on what we learn from our remaining guests." As if summoned by her words, the kitchen door opened to admit Rebecca. Her expression was carefully neutral as she entered. "They're awake," she reported. "Silas's head wound is clean. No signs of concussion, though he's nursing a significant headache. Mitch seems more curious than angry about the mechanism that captured him." Catherine nodded, absorbing this practical assessment. "Their dispositions?" "Silas alternates between threats and sullen silence," Rebecca replied with professional detachment. "Mitch asks intelligent questions about the trap design. He seems more interested in how it works than in escaping it." This report, delivered with the precision of a military update, further illuminated the relationship between the two women. Rebecca wasn't merely a protégé or assistant, but a full partner in Catherine's security operations, trusted with independent evaluations and decisions. "Interesting," Catherine mused. "Jackson, would you say that assessment aligns with your brother's typical responses to setbacks?" Jackson hesitated, clearly weighing the strategic value of cooperation against the principle of loyalty. Finally, practicality prevailed. "Accurate enough. Silas processes most situations through anger. Mitch analyzes problems, looking for solutions rather than culprits." "Bring them in," Catherine instructed Rebecca. "We should have this conversation with all parties present." As Rebecca departed to retrieve the remaining Corvus brothers, tension in the kitchen increased perceptibly. Whatever resolution Catherine had contemplated during the night would soon be implemented, determining the fate of 5 men who had come seeking legendary gold and instead found the legend herself. Jackson straightened as much as his bonds would, reassuming the mantle of leadership despite their compromised position. "Before your other guests arrive, perhaps we might discuss terms more directly." Catherine regarded him with the measured assessment that had once made her the most successful outlaw leader in Western history. "Terms suggest negotiation between parties with relatively equal leverage. Our current circumstances seem somewhat imbalanced in that regard." "Circumstances can change rapidly," Jackson countered smoothly. "The Corvus name carries certain associations. Our absence will be noted, investigations initiated. Sheriff Wade may be absent now, but his return brings complications for everyone in this valley." The implicit threat that pursuit would eventually follow, regardless of Catherine's immediate decisions, reflected Jackson's strategic mind. Even bound and at Apparent disadvantage, he sought leverage through longer-term considerations. A valid observation, Catherine acknowledged, unruffled by the underlying warning. Though you overestimate local concern for missing outlaws and underestimate my preparations for exactly such eventualities. Before Jackson could respond, the kitchen door opened again. Rebecca entered first, revolver held casually but ready, followed by Silas and Mitch Corvus. Both men had their hands bound before them, though they were permitted to walk unassisted. Silas's massive frame seemed diminished somewhat by a significant bruise discoloring his left temple, while Mitch's right arm showed evidence of a mild injury from their capture. Silas's expression was thunderous, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking immediate targets for his anger. Mitch, by contrast, surveyed the room with the analytical gaze of someone gathering information rather than preparing hostilities, his eyes lingering briefly on each detail, the positions of furniture, the quality of ropes binding his brothers, and most significantly, the composed elder woman who had orchestrated their capture. "Silas, Mitch," Catherine greeted them with simple dignity. "Please join your brothers. Rebecca will adjust your bindings for reasonable comfort while we talk." The casual authority in her voice, the natural command presence that had once led a dozen hardened outlaws through the most dangerous operations in Western history, seemed to register with both men. Even Silas, despite his belligerent expression, complied without physical resistance as Rebecca secured them to kitchen chairs positioned near their brothers. "Now then," Catherine began once all 5 Corvus brothers were assembled, "we find ourselves at an interesting juncture. You came seeking gold from a legend. Instead, you found the legend herself, very much alive and disinclined to surrender what she spent decades protecting." She sipped her coffee, the mundane action incongruous with the extraordinary circumstances. "The question before us is what resolution best serves everyone's interest going forward." "Forward?" Silas snorted derisively. "Lady, you may have gotten the drop on us with your bag of widow tricks, but there's no resolution where 5 grown men just tip their hats and forget. About 40,000 in gold." "Shut up, Silas," Jackson commanded sharply. "Your helpful contributions are why we're sitting here trussed like Thanksgiving turkeys." Catherine watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone evaluating group dynamics. The friction between the brothers, tactical Jackson versus impulsive Silas, revealed potential pressure points that might influence the situation's outcome. "Jackson suggests that your absence will trigger investigation," she observed, returning to their earlier discussion. "An accurate assessment in more settled regions, perhaps, but Dakota Territory in 1895 still operates with significant gaps in formal authority. Men disappear regularly into mines, mountains, or unmarked graves. Few questions follow unless powerful interests demand answers." This cold assessment of frontier reality, the ease with which men could vanish without consequence, served as a subtle reminder of the options available to her, including permanent solutions to the Corvus problem. Yet such measures create complications of their own, she continued, as if reading their thoughts. Bodies may eventually be discovered. Questions arise belatedly. Patterns emerge that draw unwanted attention. Mitch spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to careful observation. "You've maintained this identity for 17 years through meticulous attention to detail, disposing of 5 men, even in remote. Dakota Territory introduces variables difficult to control completely." Catherine inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the accuracy of his assessment. "A concise summary of one aspect of our situation." Levi Corvus, the most refined of the brothers, leaned forward slightly. "Then perhaps we might discuss alternatives beneficial to all parties, professional courtesy between colleagues in related fields." This attempt to establish common ground, framing both Catherine and the Corvus brothers as practitioners of similar trades, reflected Levi's diplomatic approach, seeking connection rather than confrontation despite their circumstances. "You misunderstand. Our relationship," Catherine corrected him gently. "We are not colleagues, Mr. Corvus. The distinctions between the Red Catherine Gang's operations and your activities extend beyond mere technical differences in methodology." "Robbery is robbery," Silas interjected bluntly. "Dress it up however you want with fancy plans and lady accomplices, but you took what wasn't yours, same as us." Catherine's expression remained unruffled by this crude equivalence. "Perspective determines much about how we interpret both history and morality, Mr. Corvus. From certain vantage points, similarities might appear to outweigh differences. From others, the distinctions become essential rather than incidental." This philosophical response, elevating their discussion beyond immediate circumstances to broader questions of interpretation, demonstrated the intellectual depth that had separated Catherine Morgan from typical outlaws of her era. Where most lived entirely within the concrete realities of their profession, she had maintained awareness of its place within larger social contexts. "Your situation now requires similar perspective," she continued. "5 paths diverge from this. Kitchen today. Which you follow depends on decisions made in the next hour." Vern, who had remained silent throughout these exchanges, spoke up unexpectedly. "What are the 5 paths?" Catherine turned her attention to the youngest brother, her expression softening slightly as it had during their pre-dawn conversation. 5 brothers, 5 potential futures, not necessarily identical. This cryptic response, suggesting she contemplated different outcomes for different brothers rather than treating them as a single unit, introduced a new dimension to their predicament. The solidarity that had previously united the Corvus brothers against a common captor suddenly faced the possibility of individualized treatment based on Catherine's assessment of each man. Jackson's expression darkened at this implication. "We ride together. Whatever arrangement is reached applies to all of us." "Admirable loyalty," Catherine acknowledged, though perhaps premature given the circumstances. Not all crimes carry equal weight, nor do all participants bear identical responsibility. She rose from the table with the careful movements of age and moved to the window, gazing out at the sunlit valley below her property. The strategic position of her homestead became even more apparent in daylight, situated on a gentle rise that provided clear sightlines in all directions, with no approach that couldn't be observed well in advance of arrival. "Sheriff Wade returns in 2 days," she observed, her back still turned to the brothers. "A good man by frontier standards enforces the law as written rather than as purchased by powerful interests. He would certainly be interested in capturing the Corvus gang, responsible for the Blackwater stage robbery last autumn that left a passenger dead." This specific reference, accurately connecting the brothers to a particular crime, demonstrated that Catherine's knowledge of their activities extended beyond what might be expected from isolated rumors. Like the Red Catherine of legend, Catherine Blackwood had maintained awareness of criminal operations throughout the region, gathering intelligence through channels invisible to casual observation. "Turning us over means exposing yourself," Levi pointed out. Difficult to explain how an elderly widow and her niece captured 5 experienced outlaws without revealing capabilities that raised their own questions. Catherine turned back from the window, her expression unreadable. "A valid consideration, though perhaps not as definitive as you imagine. Alternative narratives exist that might satisfy official curiosity without necessitating complete disclosure." Rebecca, who had maintained her vigilant position near the door throughout these exchanges, spoke up unexpectedly. "The hunting party from the Miller Ranch expected through the valley today, according to Jenkins at the general store." This seemingly innocuous information, a local hunting group's movements, clearly carried strategic significance between the two women. Catherine nodded slightly, absorbing this detail into her calculations. "Circumstances evolve," she commented. "Options expand or contract accordingly." Jackson studied both women with increasing wariness, recognizing that layers of planning and contingency surrounded them, preparations far more extensive than might be expected from a simple homesteader concerned with basic security. "What do you want?" he asked finally, cutting through philosophical abstraction to practical resolution. "Every negotiation has core interests beneath stated positions. What outcome would satisfy yours?" The directness of the question, focusing on Catherine's fundamental objectives rather than tactical maneuvers, reflected Jackson's strategic mind. Despite their adversarial positions, he sought to understand her underlying motivations as a pathway to potential agreement. Catherine regarded him thoughtfully, weighing how much to reveal of her true considerations. "My primary interest is continuation of the life I've built here, peaceful, productive, and private. Secondary considerations include appropriate dispensation of justice and maintenance of certain principles that have guided my decisions for decades." "Justice is negotiable depending on perspective," Jackson observed carefully, "as are principles when circumstances demand flexibility." A faint smile touched Catherine's lips, acknowledging the sophisticated attempt to establish common ground. "Through moral relativism, some principles bend more readily than others, Mr. Corvus. Mine have held their shape through circumstances far more challenging than our current situation." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.